So, hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a regional inequality policy advisor at the Peterloo Institute, and I'm also currently a data analyst at Stockport Council in the field of child social care, and also a current master's student in politics and policy. So in this presentation, I'll be discussing the research work I did at GMCA during my summer internship, where I applied mixed methods to identify how to boost the uptake of pension credit, which is a means-tested benefit for lower income pensioners. And I have to emphasize, this is not going to provide any groundbreaking insights in terms of social research methods. This piece of work was very much condensed into a period of around 2 months. So I was working within a rapidly moving brief as well, which left little time for sort of systematic studies of the kind that other speakers have talked about. But I hope this presentation will give you some kind of idea about how practical public sector policymaking can look in organizations like GMCA, and how research forms a part of it. So there's a few points I want to cover in the presentation. So I'll briefly explain to you what this project was about and what motivated this piece of work. Then I'll talk a little bit about quantitative methods with a particular focus on mapping. I'll also give some practical tips on how to get started with mapping for anyone who's interested. And then I'll move on to qualitative methods, particularly interviews, and the work that we did with the Behavioural Insights team, or Nudge Unit, which some of you may have heard of. So the context of this work is some pretty alarming figures. So pension credits are a really key way of topping up the incomes of low-income pensioners, and especially women, who often don't qualify for the full state pension because of caring work, leading to gaps in paid employment history. And around a third of those eligible are not claiming this benefit. And that's despite repeated campaigns over the years by government and charities to try to address this problem. And last year, as you may have heard, the government withdrew the free TV license fee for over 75s, with the exception of those claiming pension credits. So this really further increased the financial burden on those that aren't claiming pension credit. And as a result of this, the Aging Herbert GMCA, which is an aging focused policy working group, decided that something needed to be done about this, and asked me as a summer intern to do a piece of research and draw up a set of proposals to present to a GMCA board. So the strategy I took was first of all to define the scale of the problem of so-called eligible non-recipients in Greater Manchester, and understand where current claimants are concentrated, both geographically and demographically. And this was where mapping and quantitative research was, of course, particularly important. And then the next step was around identifying barriers to claiming. So I was drawing on a wealth of existing research, as well as doing some of my own. And then we sort of drew on conversations with different partners, the voluntary sector and the public sector, to identify some possible solutions, including both kind of more ambitious systemic solutions and also possible easy wins that we'd be able to start working on immediately. And this work fed into a policy brief for GMCA leads to consider on pension credit, as well as a proposal as part of the central government comprehensive spending review to fund referral and advice services to try and increase the claimant rate in Greater Manchester. So as I mentioned, the first step was to understand where and also among which groups pension credit claimants were concentrated, and also how many were eligible but not claiming. So I was able to use entirely publicly available data to do this. So local geographies are available on the Office of National Statistics and Ordnance Survey websites, and benefits data on DWP's StatExplore portal. There's lots of similar portals to this that are very useful depending on your policy focus. And I use different kinds of visualizations, bar charts, scatter plots, and maps to identify different trends kind of across different demographics over time and also between localities. I use mapping extensively to build up a picture of some of the spatial inequalities between LSOAs or lower super output areas and ward across the 10 Greater Manchester boroughs. And you can see a couple of examples of these outputs here, focused on Manchester specifically. And this helped us to explore some of the huge inequalities and reliance on pension credit. It helped identify some possible target areas for interventions in kind of the next stage of the research, as well as demonstrating how heavily gendered the pension credit issue is. And kind of as a bit of a side, I know this isn't exactly within the brief of this presentation, but I wanted to give you a very quick tour of QGIS because I found it very useful in my research. It's a very useful piece of open source mapping software, and I found it very easy to get up and running with. So I'll just give you a very quick rundown. I got started with mapping kind of within 30 minutes, and some things you need to know. So you'll need your vector layers, which include sort of geographic coordinate data that you can find on the ONS website, like GeoJSON and shapefiles. And you'll need your delimited text layers, which are kind of CSV files holding the data that you want to visualize. In my case, this was things like the density of pension credit claimants in each ward. As you can see, these are basically the only steps that you need. You can create a map in less than 5 minutes. So you can add a vector, first download QGIS and then add a vector layer, add a delimited text layer, and then right-click properties, make a join, then decide on your color scale in symbology. And that's it. A map will appear of the geographies that you want to focus on. Very simple process, and I think anybody can get started with this very quickly, and it's useful to all kinds of applications. So obviously, quantitative data are not neutral and objective, certainly in my work at GMCA, and also currently at Stockport. I've become very conscious of the fact that there's always a story being told, and you need to approach this sort of thing cautiously and also critically. And I'll give you a few examples of what I needed to watch out for based on my pension credit work. So I was very much limited by what data was available. So data isn't collected on claimant rates by ethnicity, housing tenure, or any number of other demographic factors, which immediately put limits on what I was able to focus on, what questions I was able to ask the data. Another issue was that data on eligible non-recipients weren't available at a regional or a local level. And this made our estimates very much provisional. This was something I had to continually emphasize when presenting some of our findings to kind of people who weren't submerged in the data. And also the stories that we tell very much depend on our geographic focus, what kind of geographies we're looking at. So if you're looking at ward level data, it's very likely that you'll miss pockets of acute deprivation and social need in otherwise wealthier areas. And also sample size proved a major issue when looking at smaller geographies. For instance, the Deansgate ward in central Manchester actually turned out to have fewer than 50 pensioners in total. And that made it very difficult to draw any usable conclusions. And also I relied heavily in terms of providing context on the indices of multiple deprivation. And these are composite indices, and they're made up of lots of different factors. So it's important to be aware of what's included and what's excluded from these kinds of indices. So certainly overall quantitative methods provided some valuable insights, but using quantitative research methods alone would clearly be insufficient, and it would mean we were relying heavily on kind of the questions asked by those who were collecting the source data that we were using. So I'll now talk a little bit about qualitative methods, which we use particularly to help identify the reasons why people aren't claiming the pension credit that they're entitled to. So we found there's a lot of research already out there on pension credit and the problems of uptake produced by the Department for Work and Pensions, also voluntary sector organizations and academics. And we really wanted to place our research in a wider context, learning some of the lessons from previous campaigns and interventions and studies about the behavior of eligible non-recipients of pension credit, and also different other benefits to kind of draw some parallels. And that made the literature review a particularly important part of the process. So we evaluated existing research to build a picture of the problem. And then we spoke to a number of organizations locally, like Citizens Advice, Age UK, housing associations, local authorities, in a series of sort of semi-structured interviews, asking them about their experiences with the issue of pension credit, which helped to develop a progressively richer picture of the situation in Greater Manchester specifically, and some of the challenges involved in sort of engaging pensioners and encouraging people to apply. And that strongly informed our conclusions ultimately. But we didn't just collect the evidence from interviewees and then write it up. We kind of, that was one stage, but then we also maintained ongoing collaborations with them, and we fed back provisional findings to sense check them, and also involved them when designing policy proposals later on. And we really wanted to understand the perspective of pensioners themselves as well. But that proved quite difficult given both time constraints and lockdown. So we shared a call for evidence through neighbourhood networks, but in the end, only 2 pensioners responded in total, obviously limiting the usefulness of the data. But the interviews, I would say, still provided some additional richness and depth to the research. It helped us also to modify some of our proposals based on just the kind of sense checking that provided, and kind of understanding what people's experiences were. And then towards the end of my pension credit work, we also organized some sessions with the government's, well, it's not government owned anymore, but the Behavioural Insights team or nudge unit, to try to think through some of the behavioural barriers to claiming pension credit and some possible interventions to overcome them. And the framework that we used, I think, can help think through all kinds of problems that have a behavioural component. It involved identifying our goals, first of all, deciding on the target groups, what desired actions we wanted to encourage these groups to take, and then the barriers to these actions. And this was used to help design an intervention which is currently being tested and evaluated, I believe. But unfortunately, I finished my internship soon after, so I'm not really very up on the details and what happened with that. But I'd say it was a very useful experience to inform our approach to research and thinking through some of the problems. But it's also important to be aware of the limitations of this, and how the questions that we ask affect how we understand the nature of a policy problem. So nudge approaches have been criticized for their individualizing approach to problems, and I would agree with that criticism to a certain extent. It suggests that collective social problems can be solved by improving individual behavior, improving, in the case of pension credit, arguably the problem's much more systemic, which is kind of the gendered neoliberal design of our benefit system. That's something I got very much a sense of from my research. And there's a risk that these sorts of issues will be obscured if focusing on discrete targeted interventions, focusing on specific behaviors. But in the context of limited resources of local government, these approaches are often very attractive and can help boost the impact of campaigns and campaign design. So all of the evidence from these sources came together in a policy briefing document that we presented to GMCA executives, including an analysis of the scale of the problem and then a set of proposals. The analysis section blended insights from quantitative and qualitative methods throughout. So the insights we drew from the interviews informed our discussion of the quantitative data, and it helped to contextualize what we drew from the maps, graphs, and so on, and filling in the gaps that weren't covered by the statistics that were available. And here are a couple of sample pages of what we wrote. And the briefing really had to be very pithy and sell itself, setting out why this issue really matters, why it deserves funding. And this meant distilling and simplifying 2 to 3 months of research into a digestible, easy to read form. I believe nobody read all 25 pages. The executive summary was crucial to make sure that our research landed. And this really drove home sort of the differences between academic and practical policy research. And it meant showing the cross-cutting relevance of pension credit to live policy issues, like the amount of money that's lost to the local economy by pensioners not accessing this benefit, linking to issues like fuel poverty, because pension credit helps to unlock winter fuel payments. All kinds of things like that really came into their own in that stage. So I just wanted to finally reflect on some of the differences between academic and practical policy research in my experience. So first of all, hands-on policy research is all about trying to find practical and achievable solutions to a policy problem in real time. It often involves quickly responding to policy windows where there's opportunity to make real progress. And in this case, this was the restriction of free TV licenses to over 75s claiming pension credit. It involves a sort of process of bricolage, bringing together insights, data, ideas from all kinds of different sources, including academics' work. And it's often a much more open and less systematic way than academics do. And it can involve a broad and very varied set of proposals when you're writing the kind of brief that we did. And that helps kind of define the future research work that might be done, depending on political will and resources available. So this kind of research really has to make the case for putting more emphasis on a policy issue. So in my experience, this kind of research involves gathering information from stakeholders, also who are not just interview subjects, but are also likely to be ongoing partners that you need to work with to achieve successful policy implementation. So these are just some of my insights. I'm sorry I went over time, I think slightly. It was a bit shorter when I practiced, but yeah, I hope that was hope that was interesting, and yeah, I look forward to any questions.